So we're continuing work on this 2010 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon Unlimited, and today we're doing rear axle seals, axle bearings, backing plates, and parking brake shoes. So I've already done the right hand side, and I thought I would show the steps to disassemble. This you can buy from the manufacturer, from the dealer, as a complete assembly with the parking brake mechanism, parking brake shoes, everything attached, bolted on. So we're going to pull this side apart. First thing you do is pull the wheel off, brake caliper, support the brake caliper, and take the rotor off. And as you can see, the backing plate is pretty rusty. The parking brake mechanism is all seized. And we have to disconnect this wheel speed sensor and loosen it off. It probably won't come out of the hole because the hole is in the steel, rusts, and it won't come out, but you'll be able to turn it a little bit because it's going to interfere with the wheel bearing retainer when we try to pull the axle out, because you got to pull the axle out with a slide hammer. So let's get these 4 nuts off the back here, this wheel speed sensor disconnected, these 4 nuts off, and put the slide hammer on the axle. So to remove that wheel speed sensor, once you remove the little 6mm bolt back here, you can pry between the axle shaft and the end of the sensor, push it straight in. Don't try and turn it because it'll be rusty in there and it might break off. Chances are it won't come out of the hole because the hole is full of rust. You'll have to clean the hole with a pick or something to get the sensor out, but you need to move it out of the way because that axle bearing retainer inside here won't clear the sensor unless you do that. Once you remove the 4 nuts, we can install a slide hammer on here and pull the axle out. So we're going to do that next. So we're ready to try to pull this out with a slide hammer. That's it. There's the axle shaft. Once you get that out, then you can take the slide hammer adapter off of it. And then the seal we need to change is inside here, which means we have to cut the bearing retainer, press the bearing off, and then pull the seal out, clean up everything and reverse it. But we're also going to remove this backing plate assembly and replace it with a new assembly. Okay, put that off to the side. So there's a look at that wheel speed sensor, and you can see that you push it straight in by prying on the end of the sensor, pushing it straight in. If you try to twist it, it'll likely snap off. Now, it probably won't come out of here because that hole is very close tolerance. You can see it almost goes through. Don't try and force it. We got to get in here with a pick and pick some of the rust out so that we can get the sensor out of there, so when we hit the back of the backing plate, we don't damage the sensor. So I found if you use a long punch on an air chisel from the back side, you can push the backing plate off with that flange. So I'm going to try. Go on this side. And back on this side. There we go. Just like that. Oh, and by the way, it disconnects from the parking brake cable on the way down. That wasn't intentional, but it worked out. It just unclips from this parking brake cable. It just happened to come off. So now we got to slide hammer this bearing out of here. Bearing race. We'll get set up and do that now. So now we're going to remove this bearing race with a slide hammer. It usually comes out fairly easy. Just keep working it uniformly. Ta-da! Just like that. Now we clean up this flange area, clean up the housing, and get ready to reinstall the new parts. So I put after cleaning this flange up with a Roll-Lock sanding disc, I like to put some Never Sees on here, just to discourage it from rusting, and if I ever take it apart again, but I do probably never will. The new backing plate assembly are the same right and left. So that's it there. Hook the park brake rod on and then slip it over the flange and line up the bolt holes right there, just like that. Now we're ready to pull the bearing off the axle shaft. So this is the axle bearing retainer and the 4 bolts we took off. That's the actual axle seal there, axle bearing, and then the bearing retainer. So we have to sacrifice this part. We have to cut this with a cold chisel and then press it off, press the bearing off, and then reverse the process to put it back together again. So use a really good cold chisel and a fairly heavy hammer, clamp it in the vise and hit it until you split that ring. And it's going to take a bit. You get the idea. Pick up when we get it cut. So now I got the bearing retainer split and pushed down. We're going to put a split flange in here on this side here to push the bearing off in the press. So there's a setup in the press to press the bearing off. Use a split flange under the bearing retainer like this, set up in the press. Now my split flange is just a little bit on the small side. It barely is wide enough. My press is barely tall enough too. Basically, press the bearing off like so. Now you can't press the retainer off and the bearing at the same time. I've never had any luck. You got to sacrifice that retainer. A new bearing and retainer come as a kit. So once you remove the bearing and the retainer, as you can see, the bearing got destroyed in the pressing action and the retainer is destroyed obviously. Then you need to turn and clean the axle shaft off and check for wear marks where the seal would run. This one's pretty good, so if there was any marking on there, you can clean it up with crocus cloth or emery cloth. Got to be careful not to damage this speed sensor reluctor. Next to go on is going to be the bearing retainer. Goes on like so. Then the seal. And then we got to press the bearing on. I'll show you how that's done. So this is the part number of the bearing. It's an SKF bearing BR10. Comes with the bearing assembly and the actual retainer. That goes on after. Now it's very important that the bearing be installed correctly. There's a right way and a wrong way. This, you saw how the tapered cone stayed in there. So this has to go inboard and this out towards the wheel. Here's the part number of the seal, and of course it has to go in with this side towards the differential case, the oil against this surface. I'm going to put some grease on the seal lip and we're going to slide it over the axle and then slit the bearing on top of it and get ready to press it back together again. So there's my setup for pressing the bearing back in. I'm using an old bearing race here as a sleeve, which is slightly bigger than this bearing surface, and it's pushing up on the bearing and I'm pushing down on the axle shaft in the press. Press the bearing on first, and of course you have to make sure the seal's in there and the bearing retainer's on there, and press it until it bottoms out. You'll feel the press stop going down. That's the end of it. Now we simply slide the bearing retainer on there and repeat that. So wipe out the housing. Put a little bit of Teflon sealant around the outside circumference of the seal. The bearing is already packed with grease, and we're going to make sure that it gets lubricant from the differential when we fill it back up again. And part of this job is also to make sure the vent is free and it's not plugged, because if the vent is plugged, it's going to put pressure on the seals. So we're ready to install this. just like so. Now we put some Loctite on those studs sticking through the back. Put the nuts back on and torque them up. And reassemble the backing plates. Oh, we install the wheel speed sensor and reassemble the backing plates. So there's the back wheels on it. I'm waiting for the diff cover. And I still have to check the differential vent up there. And make sure the parking brake adjustment is good. I rough adjusted it as before I put the rotors on. But we're getting there slowly with this vehicle.